Real Space Strategy Live with Christopher Stone. And my name's Alex Littlefield. I'm the Chief of Staff here at the National Institute of Deterrence Studies, or what we like to say NIDS for short. NIDS is a 501c3 think tank, and our motto is Think Deterrence. We live our motto of Think Deterrence through education, research, and consulting. To get to know us better, you may listen to our podcast, the NIDS View and NIDS Knowledge, which also includes Chris's podcast. And we also have education through the NIDS Academy and a journal, Global Security Review. And we hope that you would follow us and these events all at thinkdeterrence.com. We also have Peter Husey seminars, and we'll have one tomorrow with Chris Yaw that will be at 10 a.m. And so I hope to see you there as well. You know that you are invited to interact with our speakers, and that's how we use the emoji hand if you want the camera and the mic. And so you can shoot your question to either Chris or Pat, maybe specify. And if you're feeling a bit shy about being on the camera and mic, of course, you can put your questions in the chat box, and we'll be happy to answer those for you. Also, I'm pleased to say that our president, James Petrosky, is here. And so this being our inaugural episode of RSS Live, he's excited to introduce the group to you today.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, Jim Petrosky, president of NIDS, and I'm extremely excited to begin launching this new set of seminars that are somewhat of a legacy of Peter Husey and his events that he did with space. But now we've got the Chris Stone brand attached to this from his Real Space Strategy podcast, and now the Real Space Strategy Live, where we'll give you an opportunity to interact with folks and hear from people that are in the business. And today, I'm especially excited to have Major General retired Patrick Cobb as part of the discussion that's going to occur right in front of you. And then you'll be able to ask questions further from the two of them. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Chris Stone. Again, Jim Petrosky, thinkdeterrence.com is where you find all of the things that we do, to include Chris Stone and his Real Space Strategy. Chris, off to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, welcome to Real Space Strategy Live, where the goal is to give everyday folks a look inside of space policy and strategy making processes in the DC area. And as was mentioned, unlike the podcast, we give you an opportunity to ask questions of myself and the guest following our initial dialogue, which will probably be about half an hour. So around half an hour from now, we'll start opening up for questions, and we look forward to that. Today's topic is one that's very timely, as well as important to our nation's national security and domestic response posture, and that is the establishment of a Space National Guard. While many, as you'll hear today, have been fighting for and against this idea for over 5 years now, since Space Force was established in 2019, with incoming President Donald Trump's stated public support for the establishment of such an organization as the premier warfighting reserve of the U.S. Space Force, a once thought dead issue is now back at the forefront of the space policy discussion. So with me to discuss the background of this topic and what the future might hold during the next administration is retired Major General Patrick Cobb, who was the first National Guard General Officer engaged in the discussion of Space Force establishment timeframe, as also was the first Deputy Director of Space Operations for the National Guard Bureau. General Cobb, thanks for joining us today, sir.
Hey, great. I really appreciate the invite from the Institute, and I enjoy being here today. Hopefully, I'll be able to answer questions for everybody and have a good podcast today. Thanks.
Yeah, and I like the beard too, sir. That's a nice different change that I'm used to.
Yeah.
So to set the stage for those that might not be familiar with what happened inside the Pentagon and the National Guard Bureau during the early days of this topic, which was 2018, 2019 timeframe, tell our listeners, if you would, how you got involved in this process and what the initial discussions were regarding the Space Guard.
Yeah, not a problem. So, it happened. It was really a no-notice action here. So if take folks back, is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and I believe the Secretary of Defense were over at the White House for a separate event going on at the White House. And near the end of the event, President Trump at the time said, by the way, General Dunford over there is going to stand up a Space Force. No discussion prior to that had taken place as far as everyone knew with the president about a Space Force. And so the chairman came back. They had quickly had a meeting with the Joint Chiefs. And at the time, General Lingell, the chief of the Guard Bureau, came back the next day, sat down and said, okay, every member of the Joint Chiefs needs to have a lead for their service or their component to go into the OPT that was happening. And so General Lingell, specifically for the Guard Bureau, said, I want to keep this at the joint level because it's going to be peeled out eventually as a separate service. So I want to keep it at the joint piece here to work directly for himself. And then so he chose, I guess I was the slowest guy walking through the hallway at the time, and he picked me to be the lead for it. Because at the time we had no idea what was going to be in this. I mean, this was the very start of it. So we knew at the time we had Space Forces both in the Army and the Air National Guard. So the, going in assessment was potentially both capabilities or personnel and missions were going to be pulled out of every service that did space. So I was selected to go in there. So we started up the OPTs, going through the Pentagon, very fast and furious. A lot of meetings going on. We brought in a handful of people who were already on the National Guard Bureau staff, who had space background, or also had programmatic backgrounds, cyber and ISR backgrounds there to help out. On that, staff grew a little bit. We drug you over from another assignment to help out, if you remember.
Yep.
A very small staff to start some of those initial discussions. Like I said, the chief wanted to keep it on the joint side instead of trying to hand it off to the Army or the Air Guard staffs, because like I said, we didn't know exactly where it was going to go at the time. There were a lot of individuals or a lot of organizations for stand up a Space Force inside the Pentagon, a lot of them against. And I would say within the National Capital Region, you had those two factions kind of fighting it out. You could see it daily in newspapers and opinion pieces throughout the social media sphere out there. So as we started getting closer and the momentum shifted towards there was going to be a Space Force, that a Space Force was going to be turned on, the discussions between General Lingell and the other leadership within the building, General Lingell decided to stand up the Director of Space Operations, once again still on the joint staff. And that's when he brought in Major General White from Colorado to stand up and be the first Director of Space Operations inside the Guard Bureau. And I fell underneath him as his deputy. He made that decision in late December. General White came in January of 2020. And then that's when the staff, I say grew. We grew by maybe 10 personnel to help manage the overall staffing of trying to stand up a Space National Guard and work with the Space Force and the Air Force Reserve on what the future would look like at the end of the day. So hopefully that answered the question there, kind of the history behind how that worked.
Yeah, I remember that event when the president came. I was actually headed back to join OSD policy as an appointee, and I was watching. It was the National Space Council meeting in June of 18 when the president had a few remarks, and then he looked over, like you said, to the chairman and said, "You got that? Okay." So that was good. And by the way, for folks who may not be familiar with this, and if you want to add something before we move on to the next thing, you had mentioned that there were Space Forces in both the Army and the Air Guard, and the Air Guard obviously having the preponderance of Guard space units. For example, I'll just mention this, and you can add, whichever other units you want to say, but the Air National Guard, as it currently sits, has about 60% of the Space Force's space electronic warfare capability. So the jammers, what both CCS is called counter-comm system and the bounty hunter system. And so the fact that this has been something that's taken this long and has been fought so hard is something that's very interesting to a lot of people. So if you want to mention, I know Intel is one of your big areas. What kind of stuff is in the Guard space-wise for everyone's essay on that?
Yeah, so you mentioned the electronic warfare capabilities. We also have a command and control function sitting out at NRO with the New York Guard that helps with that mission set. We have some folks who actually operate constellations out in California. The survivable and durable mission set in Colorado. We also have the early warning radars in Alaska, and then the intelligence mission inside Ohio. standing up a couple more missions in Hawaii also. One of them was originally going to be in Guam, but Space Force made a decision not to put it in Guam and rotated one of those missions to Hawaii. So now Hawaii's standing up two missions as we speak right now. Just real quick, on a couple of these missions, one, the Ohio mission was, they've been doing that mission since BRAC of 2008. As that unit lost its F-16s in Springfield, Ohio, we turned a group of the manpower there into a squadron that tag teamed with National Air and Space Intelligence Center to do space intel. And so they've been kind of working space intel since about 2008, 2009. A significant amount of experience in that unit working space intel capabilities. A great capability there for space intel, where the Air Force just didn't have a lot of that from an active duty perspective. They had it on the civilian side from NASIC, but active duty folks rotate in and out every few years, so you didn't have that from a uniform perspective. And then a couple of the other ones, and I was at the Guard Bureau back, way back in the day when space, information warfare, and intelligence were all grouped together inside a division. And so I remember the days when the early warning radar mission in Alaska and the survivable and durable mission in Colorado were handed off to the Guard because AF Space at the time, decided that was a better mission for the Guard to pick up. They were actually having challenges recruiting folks to the Alaska mission because it was a remote. And then they thought at the time that the survival and durable mission would be a better mission for the Guard in Colorado. So just watching the history of how the Guard got into space and the space missions itself, it's kind of interesting being a person on the cube over from the space FAM and the space PEMs inside the Air National Guard at the time, and watching it happen is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that was back in the early 1990s for those that aren't familiar with the timeline. So there's been space activities in the National Guard going back to the early 90s. Now, I recall, flashing back to 2018, 2019 again, I recall that during that time frame, that many in the interagency, specifically in the Pentagon and other White House and congressional entities, there were pushes to either ignore the topic of the Space National Guard and the reserve component broadly, despite units, as we were talking about just a second ago, already doing the space mission since the 90s. And they were arguing that it wasn't cost effective and it would add more bureaucracy, et cetera, and so forth, despite the fact that all these units were already in existence. It wasn't going to be something new. So what was the view on these thoughts in the Department of the Air Force, the Pentagon broadly, and NGB specifically? Was there merit to those arguments, and were these reports coordinated with the Guard in early Space Force when you're dealing with all this?
Yeah, so a little bit of a history lesson here for folks. So during this time period, so the original plan was, okay, we're going to stand up the Space Force, we'll turn it on, but nothing's really going to happen because we're going to take about 18 months to plan this out. We're going to plan everything out. We're going to figure all of the administration piece. We're going to figure out what data systems need to be updated, DFAS, how do we turn people's, how do we make CAT cards work for a new service? And that sounds minor, but it really means if you at a turnstile in the Pentagon, if your CAT card doesn't work, then you don't go to work, kind of thing at the end of the day, or you can't plug your CAT card in to do email. So there was going to be an 18-month time period where they were going to do stuff. In addition, so as they were working towards this, and everyone was planning towards doing an 18-month planning cycle, and then we would start moving people in at the 18-month point and start focusing on all the little pieces parts. The decision was made, way above everyone's pay grade, that the 18-month time period wasn't going to work. There was concerns that if we waited 18 months, that potentially Space Force would get killed because that would take it beyond the presidential election. And if the current administration was going to be voted out, that potentially if it wasn't technically turned on and people were wearing Space Force uniforms or had Space Force CAT cards, that another administration could kill it. So they decided to get rid of the 18-month planning cycle, push forward a Space Force, get people transitioned over, transferred over, moved in. So what that meant was that they decided to go with something very small, very clean, something that wouldn't upset really anybody at the end of the day. So what was pushed forward at the end of the day was pretty much the bare minimum of what was currently in the Air Force and a couple of other pieces that were from the other services that pretty much made, I guess you'd say, made sense to everybody. So if it was a current constellation, satellite constellation that another service was operating, it got moved over into the Space Force. And the other services had nodded on it, said, of course, that makes sense. We're flying a satellite, should go to Space Force, not a problem. So that was the initial tranche of capability that turned on in the Space Force. They told everything else was going to be decided the next year or the next couple of years. And so in that bucket was also Space National Guard and or a Space Force Reserve at the end of the day. So that was the plan. Leadership decided, okay, we'll accept that. We understand this is the decision from the appointed leadership, and we're going to move forward on that at the end of the day. At the same time, though, we started getting pushback and friction from some individuals of why do we need a Space National Guard? We need to do a clean sheet approach on everything. This is our one opportunity to stand up a service from scratch since 1947. So we need to do this from day one. Let's pick something totally brand new. Let's think outside the box. Let's go around to other places, other services throughout the world. Let's see what they're doing out there. And so we had to go through a number of drills inside the Pentagon with the active duty, the reserves, and our team with the National Guard to look at other options out there. And at the end of the day, as we went through all these different drills, it came down to, from what we saw and what folks landed on was, you could potentially take the reserves and turn them into more or less an IMA type pool, and you could keep the Space National Guard for that unit reserve construct, that unit equipped surge to war capability that we currently perform right now inside the Air National Guard. So that was the big driving factor at the end of the day, and that's kind of where we're sitting right now. Congress required in at least 3 NDAs for a study for DoD to come out and do a study on what's the best way ahead for a reserve component for the Space National Guard. And as far as I know, it has never been published from DoD. It's been stopped at some point along the way.
Yeah, I'll just add a few odds and ends just for people. And I've mentioned this on some of the podcast episodes, so if you're interested, feel free to check those out. But the original intent for the Space Force was to have a department of the Space Force. So the original Space Policy Directive 4 called for that. As the general here is mentioning, and as you're mentioning, obviously, sir, correctly, is that in order to get things done on a quicker timeline, they had to make compromises with a lot of people in order to get something over. And as you mentioned, a lot of what came over was basically Air Force Space Command active duty component only, while the Reserve and the Guard were kind of in limbo. There were some studies that were separate from Air Force FFRDCs and other study groups that were supposed to look at that, but they were specifically told to leave the Guard off. With regards to so that's why we got, as I called it, an anemic service that basically wasn't necessarily organized and equipped to do its mission on day one, and has been having a lot of hard times trying to get it moving. And thankfully, because of that, it's still in existence, but still needs a lot of help. Now, on the reports, though, there were 3, as you mentioned. Each of them, for the most part, supported the Space National Guard, but was never released. And simultaneously, though, there were other reports. So I'll just say this for everybody, because real space strategy is supposed to give everybody a little bit of insight on how sort of the sausage is made. So when you see a congressional study ordered in an NDAA, for example, sometimes that's because they really are interested. Sometimes it's because they don't want to make a decision at that point in time. And so they want to find a way to gather some information so the issue is not dead. They just didn't have time to finish it that cycle. So you had that happen 3 times, plus a private sector Institute for Defense Analysis study that came out arguing for a department or not a department. But every single one of them supported a Space National Guard. And as you mentioned, sir, also that reserve, however you want to deal with the reserve, but the Guard was going to remain a thing because for years, the space side of the Air Force and the Army, for that matter, understood the cost-effective nature of the ability to build out capabilities without necessarily asking for more bodies because of how things work differently between that. So
Right.
with all of that crazy, so sometimes a study like the CBO study and others can be used as impetus for editorials that can influence congressmen to fight against it, to argue against it. The CBO study, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't recall anybody from CBO interviewing anybody at the Guard Bureau for what the actual numbers were on what a Space Guard would entail. And it was a lot cheaper in reality than what they said in that report. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think if you go in and look at the CBO report, so a couple of things on the CBO report, and you're spot on. They never came back and specifically interviewed anyone inside the Guard Bureau about Space National Guard. One. Two, they were told to hurry up and get it knocked out pretty fast because they were hitting timelines for budget cycles. So they wanted something to be able to present in front of Congress so they could make a decision one way or the other. So it was a quick turn on their report. But if you go in and actually read it, it's really caveated a lot. So if you actually take time to read it versus trying to just pull out sound bites to make an opinion piece, it actually, you can go, okay, it does make some sense when you look at it. So the study gave a cost range from like 100 million annually for it, but that was on the assumption, and this is the big thing, the assumption that it would flush out a Space National Guard with Space National Guard units in all 54 states, territories, and the District of Columbia, just like the Air National Guard and the Army National Guard, which the National Guard has never once said that we wanted or two is a requirement, because we base all of our requirements off of the requirements coming out of the Pentagon based on war planning and what the requirements are that the president comes in the budget at the end of the day. So
Yep.
we know if you did that, the Space National Guard would actually be larger than the actual Space Force at the end of the day. So that just didn't make any sense right off the top. What we were looking at is to actually take the current numbers of Air National Guardsmen, because at the end of the day, they said what this Army National Guard currently does needs to stay with the Army based on the mission sets and how they delineated what would stay and what would go from the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps kind of thing. So the Army Guard was kind of off the table kind of early on in the discussion. So we're really looking at all the Air National Guard units. So to take those Air National Guard units, pick them up out of the Air National Guard and turn on a Space National Guard was going to cost us about $250,000 out there. And that's really just buying the name tapes to change from the brown to the blue, new guidons, new signage at the buildings, everything that the Space Force had to do to turn their units on at the end of the day. The CBO study also said that we needed $20 million for a new headquarters building inside the National Capital Region. Like, we didn't ask for that. We don't need that because the headquarters building is the Pentagon, just like everyone else's headquarters building. Space Force doesn't have a headquarters building. They have the Pentagon. That's the headquarters building for all of the services, to include the National Guard Bureau. The chief of the National Guard Bureau sits at the Pentagon. So we would be there. If we needed any overflow, we would probably go out to Andrews, Joint Base Andrews, because that's where the Air National Guard Readiness Center sits, kind of thing. So we would tag team to where there would be actual open space at the end of the day. So when you look at the CBO study, the numbers, you looked at and go, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you looked at the caveats they ran through, you go, okay, if you take this out, take that out, okay, 250K is what the number should actually be, and that's the number people should actually be using at the end of the day. But if you want to write an opinion piece going against the Space National Guard because you want something new, clean sheet approach, then you can easily use that study for your own benefit at the end of the day. One other piece I want to bring up that was kind of interesting to see that I don't think a lot of people understood, and I would say even people inside the Pentagon or even over in Congress understood, because we haven't done this since 1947. So none of the people, that one, the checklist still doesn't exist if there ever was one to stand up a service. And then two, the people who stood that one up aren't around anymore. Is when we started when we stood up Space Force and started transitioning people over.
You still there, sir?
Yep, I'm here. Sorry about that. So there were laws over there that we didn't know that you had to actually request transfer to the Space Force. So actually, there were personnel who were full up space professionals who, because of physical limitations, could still remain in the Air Force, but if they tried to transfer services, because how the laws were written, they couldn't transfer to the Space Force. So that sounds strange, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to people on the outside, but that's how the laws were written by Congress. And so we had a decent number of people who could never transfer to the Space Force and ended up retiring or finishing up their careers as Air Force professionals, even though they were, they wanted to transfer to the Space Force. So there were a lot of these little things that we found out, the hard way, I guess you would say. And that was just one of many things that, kind of limited us when we didn't have that 18 months of planning, that we could have gone back through and said, could we get a waiver to that piece? Could we get a waiver to this? But because we had to run, headlong into standing the Space Force up, we ended up missing a lot of things at the end of the day.
Yeah, so the last 4 years, 5 years almost, we have seen the antibodies toward the Space Guard intensify with pushes for removal of the governors of the state's authorities, participation in decisions regarding state National Guard forces, space in this particular case, but it could clearly have impacts to Army and Air, and numerous reuses of a lot of these old rationales of why Space Guards were not necessary, as we talked about the CBO report, the we need to be lean and mean and no bureaucracy, and also basically not being able to do the mission that the Space Force was supposed to be for. And now there's a bill with the Congress that's supposed to basically remove any governor's say on whether or not Guard forces are moved over into the Space Force. As not a part of the Space Guard, just absorbed into some sort of nebulous single component service that would basically take all these Guard units away from the states and absorb them into the federal. So that's not typically how things have worked. Can you give us a sense of that issue and how these present challenges to the Guard and the Defense Department as a whole, especially with regard to the Space Guard in particular?
Yeah. Let me take a couple of notes here real quick, just so I don't lose my train of thought here. So I'll hit a couple of them here, and then and reattack on me if I've missed something.
Sure.
On this. So the first part on the bureaucracy piece, and we've heard this a lot, is Space Force was going to be lean and mean. This thing was going to be really sleek and push out pretty fast. And I would say, and I'm not trying to poke anyone in the eye, if you look at where Space Force started and where Space Force is now, they now have component commands, which they said they weren't going to have. They're going to stand up at least one, if not two more major commands here recently, with the announcement over the summer of, a couple of more commands.
Futures and other things like that.
Right, Futures Command and stuff. And I'm not saying those aren't needed, but once again, this is where they say they were going to be nice and sleek and no bureaucracy, and now we've got component commands and two more major commands out there. Why right now, I know with my last assignment being at Space Operations Command, they don't have enough humans to actually do the operations at the end of the day. So you're standing up additional bureaucracy where they turn around and say, well, Space Guard is a lot of bureaucracy. I would say that Space National Guard is not a lot of bureaucracy, because the actual bureaucracy day in and day out is being taken care of by the Joint Force Headquarters inside the state that manages all of the promotions and all of the other, things that, deals with taking care of humans day in and day out. Is what Space Force would get is, when you mobilize a Space National Guard, all you get is the actual combat capability moving forward. I mean, as you know, if they mobilized your unit, all they would get is the UTCs that they need, and none of the additional overhead of the administration that goes along with it.
Yep.
is they would get a C1 unit ready to go to war. And so I would say from a bureaucracy standpoint, they don't get the bureaucracy piece. From a Pentagon level piece, the National Guard Bureau is there right now anyway, is managing those humans as being taken care of by the National Guard Bureau from a POM perspective, kind of thing. So it's already built into it on that piece. From the Space Force Personnel Management Act, you know, and we saw this go into place. They used the model was the Australian Royal, or the Royal Australian Air Force Reserve set up as the basis of this. And the main reason why the Australians built this was because they were having a retention problem. They couldn't keep their pilots in, so they came up with this idea of you can serve as long as you want for how often as you want, because they needed to keep their pilots. It's an expensive proposition to train pilots and watch them go off to the airlines or other jobs out there. And from one perspective, it makes sense, is if you're going to build just an entire full-time force. So if you're, you know, and they come out and they always talk about this is a place where someone can take a knee for a little bit to go, you know, have a baby, or to go get a master's degree or something like that. But if you start looking at it going, there's no surge capacity built into that. What happens if we go to war with a near peer adversary? Where's your surge capacity? Is you're not going to have any surge capacity whatsoever built into that. And then I would go is what happens to these individuals is if you go and quote take a knee, realistically, are you stepping off the train, and are you got to be competitive for the next, you know, round of promotions or command opportunities if you've taken that knee for 4 years? And can then you also then just stay part-time for the rest of your career, or are you going to run into issues maintaining eligibility to stay in at the end of the day? Because as most folks know, at least from an officer perspective, you have to make 05 to make it to 20 years. And you can do you can make it to 04, but then you have to continue to meet, you know, eligibility boards at the end of the day. So there's a lot of unknowns in there with that piece. And like I said, how I see it is the National Guard was built specifically to be the primary combat reserve for the nation. So if Space Force needs a combat reserve, a surge capability, and that's the piece that they're missing, I think, at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, for those who may not be familiar with what 04 and 05 is, 04 is major, it's pay grade. 05 is lieutenant colonel. So
Yep.
FYI on that. No, that's Prof. So last question here before we get into the open Q&A with the audience. This past summer during the campaign season, former President Trump, now President-elect Trump, stated at the National Guard Convention that he supports the establishment of a Space National Guard, and he fully intends to make that a thing. And so after 4 years of statements of administration policy with the current administration saying, heck no, now it looks like this could be a possible thing now. So what do you think the future holds for all those Space Guardsmen out there who have been hand-wringing and trying to figure out what they're going to do with their lives? Is this a positive development? Do you think this is a sure thing, or do you think there's still going to be challenges ahead facing for Space Guard?
So I would say, you know, kind of big picture here is it's really up to the to Congress right now, because the NDA is still being discussed. We did hear, or I heard a rumor that the current NDA could be coming out today, this afternoon. So I know Space National Guard is in the House version of the NDA. It's not in the Senate version, but if they go into conference on this, there is a good chance that the House version could win out and the Space National Guard could be in there. We do know the President-elect Trump has stated that, as you said, at August, that if he became president again, he would you know, push for a Space National Guard. So I think there is a really good chance. So it's, you know, a combination between you know, the legislative and the incoming, you know, executive branch to make this happen. I think there is a really good chance it could happen out there. I think, you know, Space Force, and I think our nation needs this really at the end of the day. I mean, this one to me seems to be an easy to do, and I say easy to do is you've got space professionals in the Air National Guard who want to continue to do space, but they also want to continue to do it as National Guardsmen. and they chose to become National Guardsmen for a reason. General, now retired Major General White always said there's two types of Guardsmen out there. About 60% of Guardsmen had active duty time, so they went on active duty, and at some point they said, this lifestyle isn't for me, but I still want to serve in uniform, so I'm going to join the National Guard. And then about 40% of them looked at the active duty and said, that lifestyle is not for me, but I want to still serve my nation, so I'm going to do it in the National Guard. So it's not like they don't want to do the mission, they don't want to serve, they just don't want to necessarily serve it in an active duty capacity. And when you look at it, is your space professionals in the National Guard do it for a very specific reason. They're the surge to war piece. They're not the folks who want to go and PCS every 3 years, go to all of the PME educations, do all that. They're the ones who want to work the electronic warfare system. They want to be the folks who do the survivable and durable piece their entire career. Just like in the Air National Guard, they want to be the pilots who fly the F-16 for 20 plus years until they're essentially kicked out because they're just too old to fly the airplane anymore, kind of thing. So, and the same for me. When I transitioned to the Air National Guard, I just wanted to do intelligence my entire career. I made a wrong turn and went into the Pentagon one day, and I couldn't find my way back out for a very long time. So I think they need those people, those professionals out there who want to do that surge to war mission, because that's vital for our nation, and that's what Space Force is really lacking right now, is that capacity, that capability out there. They're using it right now inside the Air National Guard, but at a certain point, a decision is going to need to be made one way or the other. And our unit commanders have pulled their people time and again, and they've said that they would rather stay as as National Guardsmen than to go into the Space National Guard with the Manpower Personnel Act on this. If you don't mind, I want to hop into one thing that hasn't been talked about a lot, but I kind of want to get people thinking about this because it gets back to the Constitution. And I apologize for giving people a couple of credits in civics on this. But if you look at the Constitution, it's written very specific. If you look at it, as it says, we raise an army and we maintain a navy. And it was written for very specific reason. One is large standing armies are costly. They cost a lot of money. And then having a large standing army hanging around if there's nothing going on can be burdensome, can be a problem at the end of the day. And we ran into that, as with the British Army being here, during the colonial days, was problematic for us for a lot of reasons. But from a nation, a trading nation, a capitalist nation, we rely on the Navy to keep the sea lanes of communication open, which also keeps commerce open. So for the Navy, you want to maintain a Navy because you need that Navy to stay at sea. And if you talk to your friends in the Navy, to keep their career moving, the vast majority of them say you got to be at sea. Whether that's fun or not, they have to stay at sea. If they spend too much time on land, truthfully, you talk to them, their careers kind of suffer to some degree. So when you look at that model, that's how that's the model of how we built our military. At the end of the day, it goes back to the Constitution. So when you look at that, the Army relies on the National Guard. And so when the Air Force came out of the Army, that's the same way, because we have two large oceans that, kind of protect us day in and day out. So that's the same thing is the Army doesn't, it goes to war and then comes back home. The Air Force does the same thing. Well, Space Force is the same way. Is the vast majority of your space professionals sit in the continental United States, and they do their work from home station. So it just makes sense that a Space National Guard would be the pick for their reserve component, because it matches the mission set essentially of the Army and the Air Force, and so the Space Force should follow suit down that path. So if you just think of it from how the Constitution was written, how the founders of the Constitution saw how the Army should be set up, it kind of makes sense at the end of the day.
Yeah, I will add to that, and this was, and also in one of our previous podcast episodes, is that constitutionally, if you're ever wondering why we have NDAAs, National Defense Authorization Acts, and budgets every single year, it's because of this very thing that you're talking about. It's for folks listening who may not be familiar with this, you have to reauthorize the active duty forces every year. That's what the NDAA is for. The budget then funds it. But if you look at the Constitution, our foundational framework for our constitutional defense framework is primarily reliant upon the militia, which is now called the National Guard. And it's been that way since before the Constitution, but it was enshrined in that for that very purpose. And so because of what you're saying about the Air and the Army and the Navy, is you've got some very important parallels that a lot of people are forgetting about, which is why a lot of the congressmen and some senators, to their credit, are seeing this federal grab, if you will, to try to go around the law and the Constitution of taking state forces without permission of the states, is a big deal. It's not just someone saying, oh, this will be a one-time deal, which some people have said. It starts a precedent that gets down a slippery slope. So that's something that I would keep in mind also as we go on to onto the question session. So I appreciate those insights, sir. I think we can open up some more here. So let's go ahead and open up the questions from our audience. Alex, I don't know, I'll take care of that if you want me to, but if you raise your hand or however you want to do it, Alex, just let everybody know how this works.
Oh, yeah. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for that discussion and even for a civics lesson there and the background of how we came to where we are in the present. For the audience, you're welcome to raise your hand. There's that emoji, and I can give you the mic and camera to ask question to either of the speakers, or just go ahead and throw it in the chat. So there's a chat function, and also there's a Q&A if you want to put it there instead. So please go ahead and place your questions there for our speakers.
I can always call on people too, right?
Uh,
Since I know some of these people, I recognize some names. Maybe I could call on a few folks.
yeah, that would be a first, but if you know them and you're not comfortable enough to embarrass them. So it's like,
No, that's fine.
I was a teacher too, so I know what it's like to do that.
No, it's all good. So this is your opportunity to ask a major general who's now, by the way, one other thing that you didn't mention while we're waiting for hands to come up, that I recall being an issue that faced us, is that the folks working on the active duty side of the Guard, the Title 10 people, also had to endure gag orders. So when it came to advocacy for the Space National Guard, a lot of the folks in the National Guard weren't really allowed to do that because of presidential policy or lack thereof. And as a result of that, the states have the ability to advocate through their congressional staffers, as states have their own legislative affairs as well as the Guard Bureau. So the Guard Bureau is sort of the federal piece of the National Guard construct that serves as the sort of the federal liaison between the states and the services and the Joint Chiefs. And so a lot of folks had to argue for it, the adjutants generals, things of that sort. So just FYI on that. I know that we forgot to mention that, but I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that as well.
Yeah, and to hop in on that was a challenge, because a number of the states would come in and go, hey, why can't you guys fight for us on this one? And so we came back and said, well, we're Title 10, so when OMB or the SecDef's office or the SecAf's office or you name the office says that we can't talk on this subject to Congress or to the press or whatever, we were stopped. Very similar to any of the budgeting process out there. So if you go through the POM cycle every year, the budget cycle every year, you can't talk about what you're budgeting for or what you're cutting until it comes out in the president's budget. So as Title 10 members inside the National Guard Bureau, unlike the Title 32 members in the field, you're limited to what you can discuss, just like an active duty. You're technically an active duty member in Title 10 on that one. So that really limited us at the end of the day to what we could do from a Guard Bureau perspective.
Yeah.
And There's a question here from the president, from James Petrosky. It's there in both the chat and Q&A. If you see
Okay.
that there, Chris?
Yeah, so I'll just read it in case folks can't see it, especially those who are watching later on. It says, it is interesting to see how this unfolded in the upper channels of government. What effects have there been what efforts have there been to engage, inform the common public about an operationalized space domain? What do you recommend? I'm just assuming with the Guard in particular, or broadly Space Force.
So I'll attempt to answer this. So I think a couple of pieces on this is where I've seen this to operationalize a space domain. So I think some of this you see is, and I just saw it in a recent article, is a lot of people complain about the lack of speed inside space acquisitions is one thing, is we're extremely slow on acquiring stuff. So that's, almost the buzzword of the day is speed, speed, speed. Can we, SpaceX is so fast, they're getting Starlink out, they're grabbing rockets on
Chopsticks on the side of the gantry. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I appreciate that. They're doing, and I go, when you think about that, is they could have quickly at speed picked up the Space National Guard. Let's say 4 years ago, I get the clean, we got to make this thing nice and tiny to fit through the first year there. You could have turned this on and you could have had 11 or so units out there across the United States that primarily weren't sitting in the major states where Space Force sits, and help them get America to know and to better understand and introduce Space Force to the United States. And with folks who were really enthusiastic about Space Force at the end of the day. So you could have helped not only operationalize Space Force with the space professionals who were doing the mission, but you could have also gotten them to engage the U.S. citizens on space and get them better educated on Space Force, the mission, why it's important, why it's relevant, especially now with the pacing threats that are sitting out there at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think that's critical, and that's a big piece that was missed, because you see this all the time, and you'll see it every once in a while in social media where someone gets on an airplane and they'll say, "Hey, what service are you in?" They go to Space Force, and go, "That's not a real thing. That was a sitcom," or that, and you don't see that much anymore, but for the first few years you did. But that's, that's a problem Space Force has. They're a very small service, and they're generally in 3 states, really, primarily in Colorado, and then a little bit in California and Florida. So until they expand beyond that, those are the only states that are really going to understand who they are. And it's going to be really hard in Florida and California because they're really big states.
Right. And I'll just add another thing before we get to the next couple questions I'm seeing here. On that question, James, there were efforts done by the Guard Bureau before the gag order and by the states to go out and write articles, do editorials, go on radio shows, call in press conferences where the adjutants generals would get together of the space states, as they became known, to argue the why that they do that. And one of the arguments that they gave, which is true, it's not just an argument to sell the Space Guard, but it's the fact that unlike the Space Force, which has very few bases, and as the general mentioned, Florida, Colorado, California, Alaska, and a few other places, it's very important to remember that there are more Guard units across the country than that. And so if you're going to reach the public, more people know Guardsmen than they know Space Force people. So if you have a Space Guard and we have 7 states, that's 7 more states, well, 5 actually, if you leave out Colorado and Florida, 5 other states that give the public more connection to what's going on with the Space Force and how important it is, not only for the surge to war capacity for the Space Force itself, for warfighting and things of that sort, but also from a domestic mission, a emergency response function. Because as we see with North Carolina, the hurricane, things like that, you see the need for Starlink, communication capability, other things that the Guard could provide, the space expertise that the Guard could provide and has at the state level, but you don't hear about it very much because, people just assume that it's going to be there. And so I think with having the Guard do that, I think that's important. The other thing that's something that has been advertised, but they don't mention the space part for whatever reason, and that's bad on the PA, I guess, for forgetting that, or maybe the space people just aren't articulating it, is the Guard has something called a state partnership program, which is you have an allied state of various sizes and shapes all over the world. I think we have 80 to 90 of them now. And you send guardsmen over to these countries to help build up partner capacity. In other words, help them learn how to do their military mission or their domestic mission better using expertise from American airmen, soldiers, and now space professionals. And I've been participating in several of these in the past when I was in the Guard down in South America and other places. And that kind of influence capability is good from a diplomatic standpoint as well as a military standpoint. That I think is something that needs to be understood. So space is already operationalized. It's just we've made it to where it's so ingrained and integral into everyday life that people just assume it'll be there until it's not. And so with that, I saw a hand raised.
Yes,
I've
got the spotlight for Autumn here. And if she can take off her, so you have mic and camera access.
She may not, I don't know if if she has camera,
Yep.
but she.
Yeah. I've got Mike. I'm good there. Hey, sir. It's Autumn. Haven't seen you in a while. It's good to see you. Just wanted to piggyback. You mentioned the acquisition piece, right? The challenge that Space Force has had on the delay in acquisition, and even when it comes out, it's kind of late to field. Just wanted to highlight. We talked a lot about the resistance on the cost, right? The first rebuttal came out, that the cost was going to be too high. In addition to that, they mentioned, and the Guard doesn't provide advanced capabilities, or any warfighter capabilities. But the counter to that was, that's incorrect. The Guard has their own rapid acquisition cycle called NGREA, the National Guard and Reserve Equipment Account. And each year we manage, the Guard will manage about, 300 to 400 million in additional funding direct from Congress to go out and provide capability gap fillers or enhancements to the current mission sets and the current weapon systems. Yeah, that does not procure the weapon system, but with the way that space is compared to aircraft, there's a lot more options, commercial off-the-shelf technology for us to do a space mission set, especially with electronic warfare. So I guess my question is, inside the agencies, was that discussed as a counter to really highlight how the Guard can go after that quickly if we're stood up?
I would say, Autumn, and I appreciate the question, and good to hear from you again. I know it's been a while. I would say back in the day when we were standing this up in 2018, 2019, and even as I transitioned out and from the Pentagon in 21, I would say during that time frame, Space Force was still focused on the big piece, the big pieces, large systems at the time. I know they were making that shift over to, more rapid acquisition. So I don't really think that they were in, I wouldn't say not wanting to hear that, but it just wasn't resonating to talk to them about that. We could bring that up to them, but it really wouldn't stick. We'd try to bring up, and I say anecdotes, but it's a really good one. Our lightning pod, the history of the lightning pod. As we went to, Iraq and Afghanistan, and we were using lightning pods, and it was blowing the active duty out of the water, and they were like, "We can't believe the capabilities you guys have, lightning pods on your F-16s and stuff," and they were still using, I guess lanterns at the time, kind of thing, and going, "We can do this inside space. We've done it in other mission sets out there." And now you look at, you're even talking, either, very low, Earth orbit where you can put stuff up just for a few months kind of thing, which is even, less expensive. So, I mean, there's ways that I think our NGREA account and our WebTAC smart folks can get after things that can be, faster and less expensive, that we can even, help Space Force out you know, even potentially in the orbit, you know, in the orbit world at the end of the day. But now I think you bring up a very valid point that we can help in those gap areas where either they've run out of money or don't have the capability to get after it in the right time frame.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue into this next question from Chris, who says, to which extent could commercial capabilities be integrated into the Space National Guard, and how much of a justification would competitive cost be, in your opinion?
So I always go back to the Guard itself doesn't have a separate POM. We fall in line underneath the services out there. So although we POM internally to the National Guard Bureau. So in my time in the Air National Guard, we do our own separate POM in the Air Guard. So we'd knife fight in a phone booth amongst ourselves. And then once that's done, we would walk over inside the Air Force's POM. But at the end of the day, it's wrapped up inside theirs, where we don't come out with any separate capability or any separate POM line item that the Air Force doesn't approve. So I would say the commercial capabilities, Space Force would have to approve at the end of the day. But I think it would make sense is, you know, are there capabilities that, you know, since our guardsmen also have the vast majority of them, you know, about 2/3 of them to 75% have civilian jobs, would they automatically have that capability embedded in them if it's the same commercial capabilities at the end of the day? Is it a standard control system that, you know, that they're used to? So would it make sense for, you know, potentially that capability to be handed off to a Guard unit because it's maybe co-located with that company and we're running the same system just on the military side, kind of thing. So it's,
Yeah.
I think it's a potential option.
But and just real quick, I'll mention for both questions that when I was in OSD policy, one of the things I mentioned to them about the bigger picture is like the reason why the Guard has been growing so much in the 90s and 2000s and even early 2010s from Air Force Space Command side before the Space Force is because it was all that capability and knowledge, and you have decades of experience and people who build the weapon systems who also operate them in their Guard capacity, such as electromagnetic warfare, satellite command and control, things of that sort. And states do have the ability to acquire their own equipment, and a lot of places have been using that. And even on the federal side, the Space Force has some commercial capacity that we've used with international partners, like in South America, different, even EW. And that's, I think, kind of what maybe Autumn was getting after there. So with that, I want to just first of all say thank you for everybody for joining us today. Thank you again, General Cobb. I enjoy the beard and I enjoy your time here today. Again, it's good to see you. And for those of you that are interested, we have a podcast that comes out about every 2 weeks, Real Space Strategy, where we talk about similar things with other similar people that have been involved in the real world on these very, very important topics. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Alex. Do you have anything else to say before we sign off from Real Space Strategy Live?
Yes, thank you very much, gentlemen. And just we hope to see you here again tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. It's going to, I just sent a link there to RSVP. It's going to be on China's nuclear program. That's Chris Yaw. He's the Associate Executive Director for Strategic Deterrence and Nuclear Programs at NSRI, the National Strategic Research Institute, which is a Stratcom's University affiliated research center. So some of you on this have already RSVP'd to that, and thank you. And to those who haven't, hope to see you there. And thanks a lot, Chris, and to our special guest today. And see you all on our next one, which will be in 2025 of the Real Space Strategy Live.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you.